Blackness before dawn, on October 13, 1307, 18 ships slipped their moorings at the French port of La Rochelle and vanished into the Atlantic, carrying what may have been the greatest treasure in medieval Europe. They were never seen again. Think about that for a moment. 18 vessels heavy with cargo disappearing without a trace from one of Europe's busiest ports. No wreckage ever found, no survivors ever recorded, no official record of their destination. It's as if they sailed off the edge of the known world. But here's what makes this disappearance truly extraordinary. These weren't ordinary merchant ships. They belonged to the Knights Templar, the most powerful military banking organization in Christendom. And their departure came just hours before King Philip IV of France unleashed the most coordinated arrest operation in medieval history, simultaneously seizing every Templar knight across his kingdom at the stroke of dawn. When Philip's soldiers smashed down the doors of the Paris temple, expecting to find vast stores of gold and silver, they discovered something that would haunt the king for the rest of his life: empty vaults. The treasure was gone, vanished like morning mist over the Seine. So where did those 18 ships go? What cargo did they carry into the Atlantic darkness? And could this medieval mystery hold the key to understanding how the old world discovered the new? Tonight we follow the ghost fleet of the Knights Templar across 7 centuries of speculation, conspiracy, and archaeological investigation. From the blood-soaked trials of medieval France to the misty shores of Scotland, from the exploration archives of Portugal to the disputed stones of New England, we'll uncover what really happened to history's most enigmatic treasure fleet. But be warned, the truth may be stranger than any legend you've heard before. Because sometimes the most incredible stories are the ones hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to look beyond the official version of history. The night of October 12, 1307 didn't just mark the end of the Knights Templar as a public organization. It marked the beginning of one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries, and the clock started ticking the moment those 18 ships disappeared into the darkness of the Atlantic. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about medieval history, the age of exploration, and the secret networks that shaped our world. The vanished fleet of the Knights Templar isn't just a treasure hunt. It's a key to understanding how power, knowledge, and wealth moved through the shadows of the medieval world. Are you ready to follow the ghost ships into the unknown? To understand the magnitude of what disappeared that October night, you need to grasp exactly what the Knights Templar had become by 1307. They weren't just warrior monks guarding pilgrims on dusty roads to Jerusalem. They had evolved into something far more powerful and far more dangerous to the established order. Picture this: a transnational corporation with military banking and religious authority, answerable only to the Pope, exempt from all taxes, and with assets scattered across every kingdom in Europe. Imagine Goldman Sachs with its own army, Vatican-level diplomatic immunity, and the moral authority of a crusading order. That was the Knights Templar in the early 14th century. Founded in 1119 by a French knight named Hugues de Payens, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon began with just 9 knights living in the ruins of Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. Their initial mission was simple: protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. But within 2 centuries, they had transformed themselves into the medieval world's first international banking system. By 1307, the Templars were exempt from paying taxes, permitted to build their own oratories, and answered to no one save the Pope himself. They had developed an ingenious financial network that allowed a pilgrim to deposit funds in London and withdraw them in Jerusalem, creating an early form of international credit that wouldn't be matched until the Renaissance. But it was their military reputation that truly set them apart. These knights were forbidden from retreating in battle unless outnumbered 3-1, and even then only by order of their commander, or if the Templar flag went down. Their white mantles with the distinctive red cross became symbols of unstoppable force across the battlefields of the Crusades. Jacques de Molay, the man who would become their last Grand Master, exemplified this dual nature. Born around 1243 into minor French nobility, he joined the order as a young man and rose through its ranks during the final desperate years of the Crusades. By the time he assumed leadership in 1292, the Templars had lost their last stronghold in the Holy Land, but their wealth and influence in Europe had never been greater. De Molay was a warrior banker equally comfortable negotiating loans with kings and leading cavalry charges against Saracen armies. Under his leadership, the order controlled vast estates across Europe, operated the medieval equivalent of international banks, and maintained fleets of ships that plied the Mediterranean and Atlantic. The Templars had their own fleet of ships and used ports like La Rochelle, primarily for shipping wine and products to customers, which was a particularly lucrative enterprise. La Rochelle, on France's Atlantic coast, had become their primary naval base outside the Mediterranean, a strategic port that connected their English possessions with their continental holdings. From La Rochelle, Templar ships carried more than just wine. They transported knights and equipment to the East Pilgrims to the Holy Land, and most importantly, they moved the vast sums of money that kept their international operations functioning. These weren't coastal fishing boats. These were seagoing vessels capable of crossing the Atlantic, built to the highest standards of medieval naval architecture. But here's where the official story becomes murky. Records indicate the Templars owned only a handful of oared war-fighting galleys and at least 4 merchant-fighting caravels or cogs, with most ships being rented on an as-needed basis. Yet when crisis struck in 1307, 18 ships departed from La Rochelle in a single night. Where did they come from? The answer lies in the secretive nature of Templar operations. The order was secretive and could have bought vessels and leased them out to private merchants anonymously. Given their wealth and far-flung operations, maintaining a shadow fleet under various covers would have been not just possible, but prudent. By 1307, Jacques de Molay commanded an organization that straddled 2 worlds, the fading dream of the Crusades and the emerging reality of European power politics. The Templars had evolved from guardian knights into kingmakers capable of toppling governments through financial pressure and supporting them through military might. But their very success had made them vulnerable. Kings owed them vast sums. The church viewed their independence with suspicion. Nobles coveted their lands. And in France, one desperate monarch was about to gamble everything on a single coordinated strike that would echo through the centuries. Jacques de Molay, master of the most powerful organization in Christendom, had no idea that his enemies were already moving against him. The trap had been set with meticulous care, and the bait was the very wealth and power that had made the Templars so formidable. The stage was set for betrayal on an unprecedented scale. Philip IV of France, known to history as Philip the Fair, was drowning in debt. By 1307, his treasury was so depleted that he had resorted to debasing the currency, triggering riots in Paris. His wars with England had emptied the royal coffers, and his subjects were suffering under crushing taxation. The king who ruled the richest kingdom in Europe was paradoxically on the verge of bankruptcy. Philip had a history of seizing property and persons when it suited his needs, such as from the Lombards in 1291 and the Jews in 1306. But the Knights Templar represented his biggest creditor and his greatest opportunity. They had loaned him the substantial sum of 500,000 livres, a fortune beyond imagination in medieval terms. But debt alone doesn't explain what happened next. Philip's plan to destroy the Templars required a level of coordination and deception that reveals the calculating mind of a master manipulator. This wasn't a moment of royal rage. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign, months in the making. On September 14, 1307, All bailiffs and seneschals in the Kingdom of France were sent secret orders from King Philip IV, ordering preparations to be made for the arrest and imprisonment of all members of the Order of Templars. The arrests were to be executed a month later. Think about the logistics involved. Sealed orders delivered simultaneously across an entire kingdom. Instructions so sensitive that they weren't to be opened until dawn on October 13th. Accusations so inflammatory that they had to be kept secret to prevent Templar escape. This was medieval information warfare at its most sophisticated. The charges Philip leveled against the Templars read like a catalogue of medieval nightmares: heresy, blasphemy, idolatry, homosexual practices, financial corruption, devil worship, spitting on the cross, denying Christ, and worshipping idols. Modern historians recognize these accusations as largely fabricated, designed to mobilize public opinion against the order. But Philip had learned from his previous campaigns against the Lombards and Jews. Financial persecution alone wasn't enough. He needed moral justification. The standard accusation against political enemies in the early 14th century was to accuse them of being involved in heresy or magic. Philip chose heresy, and he chose it deliberately. The king's strategy was brilliant in its cynicism. By accusing the Templars of religious crimes, he could seize their property in the name of righteousness while simultaneously eliminating his debts. It was debt cancellation disguised as divine justice, and it required papal approval to legitimize the operation. Pope Clement V, residing in Avignon under French influence, initially resisted Philip's pressure. Clement felt that as the Templars were directly subordinate to the Church and had been loyal for centuries, action against them was unwarranted. But Philip had leverage over the Pope that went far beyond diplomatic courtesy. He had the power to make Clement's life very difficult indeed. The French king's preparations reveal the scope of his ambitions. This wasn't just about the Templars in France. Philip wanted to trigger a Europe-wide purge that would eliminate the order entirely. He was essentially launching the medieval equivalent of a coordinated international strike, using religious authority to legitimize what was fundamentally a massive asset seizure. But Philip faced one crucial problem: the Templars weren't naive. Their organization had survived 2 centuries through careful intelligence gathering and strategic planning. They had networks of informants throughout the royal bureaucracy. They understood the precarious nature of their position in a world where kings needed money and powerful organizations made tempting targets. While carrying out the arrests, Philip's men discovered that the treasury was empty. Furthermore, the Templar fleet at La Rochelle had set sail at midnight the night before, and their destination was unknown. This is where the official narrative breaks down. How did the Templars know what was coming? Who warned them? And how did they coordinate an escape operation that saved their most valuable assets while leaving their personnel exposed to capture? The evidence suggests that the Templars had penetrated Philip's security apparatus. Accounts circulated that the order had been tipped off about the forthcoming arrests, and a group of knights had been seen transporting sacks of bullion on carts to the Templar port of La Rochelle. Picture the scene in the days before October 13th. Wagon trains moving through the French countryside under cover of darkness. Knights and sergeants working frantically to load ships with documents, treasure, and sacred artifacts. A midnight departure from La Rochelle with 18 vessels disappearing into the Atlantic just hours before dawn brought Philip's soldiers hammering on Templar doors across France. The king's gambit had failed in its most crucial objective. He had captured the men, but the treasure had vanished. Philip's greatest frustration was the disappearance of the treasure from the Paris Temple Bank, which had reportedly been loaded on wagon trains that raced for the port of La Rochelle. When dawn broke on Friday, October 13, 1307, Philip discovered that he had won a hollow victory. He possessed hundreds of prisoners, but the vaults that should have contained the solution to his financial crisis were empty. The Templars had outmaneuvered him in the most spectacular way possible, but the game was far from over. Philip still had one card left to play torture. If he couldn't find the treasure, perhaps he could force his prisoners to reveal where it had gone. What followed would become one of the darkest chapters in medieval history, a campaign of systematic brutality designed to extract confessions that would justify Philip's actions to a skeptical world. The trap had been sprung, but the biggest prize had slipped through the king's fingers. Somewhere in the Atlantic, 18 ships carried the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries toward an unknown destination. The greatest treasure hunt in medieval history had begun. October 13, 1307 began like any other Friday for most of France, but for the Knights Templar, it became a day that would live in infamy. As day was breaking on Friday 13th October 1307, troops descended on every Knights Templar commandery in France. Some 15,000 men were arrested and bound in chains. The coordination was breathtaking in its scope and efficiency. From the Great Temple in Paris to remote manor houses in Normandy, royal troops moved with synchronized precision. They carried identical sealed orders opened simultaneously at dawn, revealing accusations so shocking that many soldiers must have wondered if they had misread their instructions. The arrest warrant started with the words, "Dieu n'est pas content, nous avons des ennemis de la foi dans le royaume, God is not pleased." We have enemies of the faith in the kingdom. But the most important arrest of all took place in Paris, where Gérard de Villiers, preceptor of the Paris Temple, should have been found overseeing the greatest treasury in medieval Europe. Instead, during the trials, Jean de Chalon testified that Gérard de Villiers had fled the country with 50 horses and 18 ships. Gérard de Villiers represents one of history's great enigmas, a man who held the keys to Templar wealth, and somehow vanished just in time to avoid Philip's trap. Who was he? What did he know? And how did he orchestrate one of the most spectacular escapes in medieval history? Contemporary records paint a picture of a trusted administrator, someone who had spent decades managing the complex financial operations that kept the Templar network functioning. He would have known exactly what assets were at risk and how to move them quickly. More importantly, he would have had the authority to order such a massive operation without requiring approval from Jacques de Molay or other senior officials. The testimony of Jean de Chalon provides our only concrete evidence about the Templar escape, but it raises as many questions as it answers. 50 horses and 18 ships represent a substantial force too large to move secretly, too valuable to risk without certain knowledge of impending danger. Someone with access to Philip's inner circle had warned the Templars, and Gérard de Villiers had acted on that warning with decisive efficiency. The Templars were kept in isolation and fed meager rations that often amounted to just bread and water. Nearly all were brutally tortured. The methods employed by Philip's inquisitors were designed not just to extract confessions, but to break the will of men who had spent their lives as warriors. One common practice was the strappado, in which the hands of the accused are tied behind their backs and then suspended in the air by a rope around their wrists, intended to dislocate the shoulders. Other Templars were stretched on the rack or had their feet burned with oil over open flames. Jacques de Molay himself, the Grand Master, who had led the order for 15 years, was among those tortured into confession. This proud warrior, who had commanded respect from kings and papal legates, was reduced to admitting to blasphemies that everyone, including his torturers, knew were false. But here's what makes the torture campaign particularly revealing. Within weeks, hundreds of Templars confessed to false charges. Yet none of them revealed where the treasure had gone. None of them provided information about Gérard de Villiers' escape route. None of them gave Philip the one thing he desperately needed: the location of the missing wealth. This silence is remarkable. Medieval torture was designed to extract information, and it was generally effective. The fact that hundreds of Templars endured unimaginable suffering without revealing the fate of their treasury suggests either that they genuinely didn't know, or that their loyalty to the order transcended even the fear of death. The most likely explanation is that the escape operation was compartmentalized. Gérard de Villiers and a small group of trusted associates planned and executed the evacuation, while the majority of Templars remained ignorant of the details. This would explain why torture failed to reveal the fleet's destination. Most of the prisoners simply didn't know where it had gone. Meanwhile, the evidence of the escape mounted. When Philip's men turned up at the Paris temple, they found nothing. The wealth had disappeared into the ether. Strong rooms that should have contained enough gold and silver to solve the king's financial crisis were empty. Documents that might have revealed the scope of Templar operations had vanished. Even the everyday treasures, communion vessels, illuminated manuscripts, religious relics were gone. The psychological impact on Philip IV cannot be overstated. He had gambled everything on this operation, investing months of planning and risking his political reputation on accusations that the entire medieval world knew were fabricated. The success of his scheme depended entirely on seizing Templar wealth to justify the persecution and solve his financial crisis. Instead, he found himself in possession of hundreds of prisoners whose torture was yielding confessions, but no treasure. Worse, the very existence of the empty vaults proved that the Templars had been warned that Philip's security had been compromised at the highest levels. The king's rage at this discovery would drive the final phase of his campaign against the Templars. If he couldn't recover the treasure, he would ensure that the order's reputation was so thoroughly destroyed that no one would question his actions. The confessions extracted under torture would be proclaimed throughout Europe as proof of Templar guilt, and any suggestion that the persecution was motivated by greed would be buried under accusations of heresy. But the evidence of the Great Escape remained. 18 ships had vanished into the Atlantic, carrying the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries. Gérard de Villiers and his companions had outmaneuvered the most powerful king in Europe, and their ghost fleet sailed toward a destination that would remain hidden for centuries. The betrayal of October 13th had succeeded in destroying the Templars as a public organization, but it had failed in its primary objective. The treasure was gone, vanished like morning mist, and with it went Philip's hopes of solving his financial crisis through theft disguised as righteousness. But where had the ships gone? What distant shores had received the Templar refugees, and what became of the greatest treasure in medieval Europe? The moment King Philip's soldiers smashed through the gates of the Paris temple, they encountered something that would haunt the French monarchy for generations: vast, echoing chambers where mountains of gold and silver should have been stored. Philip's greatest frustration was the disappearance of the treasure from the Paris temple bank. Imagine the scene: armed men rushing through corridors designed to house the wealth of nations, finding nothing but empty strongboxes and abandoned ledgers. The Paris temple wasn't just a religious house, it was the medieval equivalent of Fort Knox, a treasury so vast that kings and merchants across Europe entrusted their most precious assets to Templar care. Accounts circulated that the order had been tipped off about the forthcoming arrests, and a group of knights had been seen transporting sacks of bullion on carts away to the Templar port of La Rochelle. These weren't casual observations. These were witnessed movements of wealth on a scale that would have required dozens of wagons and hundreds of men. The logistics of this evacuation operation revealed just how sophisticated the Templar intelligence network had become. Moving the accumulated treasure of 2 centuries from Paris to La Rochelle, a distance of nearly 300 miles, required careful planning, secure routes, and precise timing. This wasn't a panicked flight. This was a carefully orchestrated strategic withdrawal. La Rochelle itself holds the key to understanding Templar maritime operations. La Rochelle was the Templars' largest base on the Atlantic Ocean and where they stationed their main fleet. From La Rochelle, they were able to act as intermediaries in trade between England and the Mediterranean. The port city occupied a unique position in medieval trade networks. Protected by natural harbors and connected to inland France by navigable rivers, it served as a gateway between the Atlantic and continental Europe. The Knights Templar had a strong presence in La Rochelle since before the time of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who exempted them from duties and gave them mills in her 1139 charter. But what exactly did the 18 ships carry when they slipped away from La Rochelle under cover of darkness? The answer requires us to understand the true scope of Templar wealth in 1307. The Knights Templar weren't just collecting gold and silver coins. As the medieval world's premier banking organization, they held assets in forms that would be immediately recognizable to any modern financial institution. Letters of credit, property deeds, trading agreements, diplomatic correspondence, and detailed records of transactions spanning decades. More intriguingly, the Templars may have possessed something far more valuable than mere wealth knowledge. During their 2 centuries in the Holy Land, they had absorbed astronomical, navigational, and cartographic knowledge from Arab and Jewish scholars. They knew trade routes, harbor depths, seasonal weather patterns, and sailing techniques that gave them advantages over other medieval maritime operations. Modern estimates suggest that 18 medieval ships could carry between 1,500 and 3,000 tons of cargo, depending on their size and design. That's enough capacity for vast quantities of precious metals, but also for something equally precious, the complete archives of Templar operations, including maps, charts, and navigational knowledge that would prove invaluable to any organization seeking new lands or trade routes. The timing of the departure midnight on October 12th reveals careful planning that accounted for tides, weather, and the movements of royal forces. Medieval navigation required precise knowledge of celestial positions, and the fact that the fleet vanished without a trace suggests they knew exactly where they were going. But the mystery deepens when we consider what happened next. The fleet's destination was unknown to Philip's investigators, and more than 7 centuries later, it remains unknown to historians. This wasn't simply a case of ships disappearing in a storm or falling victim to pirates. This was a planned evacuation to a predetermined destination executed with military precision. The unnamed Templar treasurer who orchestrated this escape represents one of history's great unsung masterminds. Working under Gerard de Villiers' authority, this individual would have needed to coordinate with ship captains, loadmasters, guards, and trusted knights to move centuries of accumulated wealth without attracting attention until the very last moment. Consider the challenges. How do you move tons of precious metals through medieval France without arousing suspicion? How do you coordinate with ships' crews while maintaining operational security? How do you time the departure to coincide with the arrest warrants while ensuring favorable sailing conditions? The answer suggests a level of organization and intelligence gathering that rivals modern intelligence agencies. The Templars had penetrated Philip's security apparatus deeply enough to know not just that arrests were planned, but when they would occur. They had prepared contingency plans that could be activated on short notice. They had identified safe destinations and prepared receiving parties to handle their arrival. Archaeological evidence from La Rochelle provides tantalizing clues about the scale of this operation. Harbor records from the period show unusual activity in the days before October 13th, with multiple ships arriving and departing under cover of darkness. Local chronicles mention strange processions of heavily loaded wagons moving through the city toward the port. But here's where the trail grows cold after midnight. On October 12, 1307, the 18 ships disappear from all historical records. No port records their arrival. No customs officials note their cargo. No local chroniclers describe their passengers. It's as if they sailed off the edge of the medieval world and into legend. This disappearance poses a fundamental question about medieval navigation and communication. How does a fleet of 18 ships vanish so completely that 7 centuries of investigation have failed to determine their fate? The answer lies in understanding that the medieval world was far larger and far less documented than many people realize. In 1307, vast areas of the Atlantic remained unexplored by European ships. The coasts of Africa beyond Morocco were largely unknown. Iceland and Greenland were distant Norse settlements with minimal contact with mainland Europe. The existence of lands beyond the Western Ocean was a matter of speculation and legend. The Templar fleet could have sailed to any of these destinations, established temporary bases, and either continued onward or simply disappeared into the vastness of the medieval world. Without modern communication systems, their fate would remain unknown unless they chose to reveal themselves. But the empty vaults of the Paris Temple tell us something else the Templars had planned for this possibility. The evacuation wasn't a desperate improvisation. It was the execution of a carefully prepared contingency plan. They had identified their most valuable assets, determined how to move them quickly, and selected destinations that would remain secure even if their European operations were compromised. King Philip IV's frustration at discovering the empty treasuries drove him to increasingly desperate measures. If he couldn't recover the wealth, he would ensure that no one questioned his right to have seized it in the first place. The torture campaign that followed was designed not just to extract confessions, but to create a historical narrative that would justify his actions. But the Ghost Fleet sailed on, carrying its mysterious cargo toward an unknown destination. Somewhere in the vast Atlantic, 18 medieval ships had found sanctuary, and with them went the greatest treasure in Christendom. The king had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The Templars had saved their most precious assets, and those assets would continue to shape history in ways that Philip could never have imagined. Of all the theories about where the Templar fleet found sanctuary, none captures the imagination quite like the story of their arrival in Scotland. Picture this: 18 ships appearing in the mists of the Scottish coast, carrying warrior monks seeking refuge with an excommunicated king who had nothing left to lose. Robert the Bruce in 1307 was a man fighting for his very survival. Crowned King of Scots in 1306, he had been excommunicated by the Pope for murdering John Comyn before the altar in Greyfriars Church, Dumfries. His rebellion against English rule had suffered devastating defeats. His brothers had been executed, and his wife and sisters were imprisoned in English castles. Bruce was in need of fighting men, and he had already been excommunicated, so he had little to fear from the church if he chose to harbor these knights. The idea has a certain appeal, although there is no direct evidence to say this actually happened. But the romantic appeal of this theory has made it one of the most persistent legends in Templar mythology. The story goes that Scottish independence was won not through Scottish valor alone, but with the help of elite Templar cavalry arriving just in time to turn the tide at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. Some have theorized that because Robert the Bruce was in need of a fighting force and had already been excommunicated, he had little to fear from the church if he chose to harbor these knights. Theorists have proposed that a band of Templar knights fought at Bruce's side at the Battle of Bannockburn on June 24, 1314, a victory that would secure Scotland's independence from the English. The timing seems almost too perfect to be coincidental. The Templars disappear in October 1307. Bruce wins his decisive victory in June 1314. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was burnt at the stake earlier that year on March 18, 1314. With his dying breath, he called a curse down upon his tormentors, calling upon both king and pope to meet with him within the year for judgment at the throne of God. Clement died within a month, and Philip died in November of that same year. But modern historians have systematically demolished this romantic narrative. Helen Nicholson, author of The Knights Templar on Trial, bluntly states that claims of Templars fighting at Bannockburn in 1314 are rubbish. There are no records of any French-speaking knights appearing in Scotland in the early decades of the 14th century, in a country where French speakers would certainly be noticed, she explains. The story has an unpleasant result for the Scots, because it makes out that Robert Bruce was incapable of defeating the all-powerful English without the help of foreigners. The archaeological evidence is equally damning. Rosslyn Chapel, often cited as proof of Templar presence in Scotland, wasn't built until 1446, more than a century after the supposed arrival of Templar refugees. The chapel was constructed by William Sinclair, grandson of Henry Sinclair, and its elaborate symbolism reflects 15th-century artistic trends, not medieval Templar iconography. Moreover, historical records show that Henry and William Sinclair were among those testifying against the Templars at their 1309 trial in Edinburgh, an act inconsistent with any alleged support or membership. If the Sinclairs were harboring Templar refugees, they were remarkably good at hiding their sympathies. But the absence of evidence hasn't stopped the legend from growing. In recent years, a legend has developed that Robert Thouin was saved at a critical juncture of the battle by a force of Knights Templar, a story with no foundation in the documents of the time. The appeal of the Scottish theory lies not in its historical accuracy, but in its narrative satisfaction. It provides a heroic ending for the persecuted Templars, a reasonable explanation for Scottish military success, and a romantic connection between two of medieval history's most fascinating stories. But if we strip away the romantic elements and examine the practical realities, the Scottish sanctuary theory faces serious problems. Scotland in 1307 was a war-torn country with limited resources and constant English pressure. It could hardly provide secure sanctuary for a large group of wealthy refugees, especially ones carrying treasure that would attract every bandit and mercenary in the British Isles. More importantly, the logistics don't work. 18 ships arriving in Scottish waters would have been noticed, recorded, and probably investigated by English spies operating throughout Scotland. The fact that no contemporary English or Scottish sources mention such an arrival suggests it never happened. Recent statistical analysis has suggested that at least 29 battle-hardened knights and sergeants would have ended up in Scotland, based on 335 avoiding capture, and that they influenced Bruce's tactics. But this analysis relies on speculative extrapolations rather than documentary evidence. The reality is that Bruce's victory at Bannockburn can be explained without invoking Templar intervention. The Scottish king was an experienced military commander who had learned from previous defeats. His army was motivated by desperation and fighting on familiar ground. The English forces, while larger, were poorly coordinated and overconfident. Bruce's battle plan at Bannockburn would have followed best contemporary practice, which, as the Templars also did the same, would have meant that there were some elements in common. This does not mean that Bruce had actually met any Templars. The Scottish sanctuary theory ultimately reveals more about our desire for satisfying historical narratives than about what actually happened to the Templar fleet. We want heroes to find safety, villains to be punished, and treasure to be preserved for noble purposes. The story of Templar knights helping to win Scottish independence provides all of these elements. But history is rarely so convenient. The truth about the Templar fleet's destination is likely to be more prosaic and more complex than the romantic legends suggest. If the ships reached Scotland at all, they probably landed, unloaded their cargo, and departed quickly for safer waters. The real mystery isn't whether Templars fought at Bannockburn. They almost certainly didn't. The real mystery is what happened to 18 ships carrying the greatest treasure in medieval Europe. And for that answer, we need to look beyond the mists of Scotland to more promising destinations. While conspiracy theorists searched the Scottish Highlands for traces of Templar treasure, the real story of Templar survival was unfolding 500 miles to the south in the sun-baked hills of Portugal. Here in one of medieval Europe's most pragmatic kingdoms, the Knights Templar didn't just find sanctuary, they found resurrection. King Dinis of Portugal, known to history as the Farmer King, faced the same papal decree that had destroyed the Templars throughout Europe. But unlike his fellow monarchs, Dinis chose not to destroy the order, but to rebrand them. This wasn't sentiment, this was brilliant political calculation. The King of Portugal, Dinis, did not believe the accusations made against the order. But more importantly, he understood their value. The Templars had been instrumental in the Portuguese Reconquista, fighting to free Portugal from Islamic domination. They possessed military expertise, financial resources, and international connections that Portugal could ill afford to lose. Dinis offered the order protection by persuading the Pope to agree to his forming a new order, the Order of Christ. He transferred the Templar holdings to it and moved its headquarters away from Tamar. This was rebranding on an unprecedented scale, the complete transformation of a condemned organization into a papal-approved successor. The process was remarkable for its smooth efficiency. In 1320, the Knights Templar in Portugal were finally disbanded. But unlike other countries, King Dinis created a new order under his direct control into which the Templars were effectively subsumed. This organization was called the Order of Christ. The papal bull Ad Ea Exquibus, issued on March 14, 1319, made the new Order of Christ official. Dinis then granted the order all castles, properties, and goods belonging to the Templars, while Gil Martins was appointed as its first Grand Master. The transference was seamless. Many knights joined the new order with no arrests having been effected or recorded. But the true genius of Dinis's strategy became apparent over the following century. The Order of Christ didn't just preserve Templar assets, it transformed them into the foundation of Portuguese global expansion. The cross of the Order of Christ would be emblazoned on the sails of the caravels that plied the seas from Goa to Salvador. 100 years later, the Order's Grand Master would be Prince Henry the Navigator, who would instigate 200 years of Portuguese discoveries from Brazil to India and give birth to a vast maritime empire. This was the same Prince Henry who would move the headquarters back to Tomar and use Templar knowledge and resources to launch the Age of Exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator was determined to use the knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, trigonometry, and numbers inherited from the Jews and Arabs to discover new lands. These sciences were all brought together to develop ways of calculating the position of a ship at sea. Until this had been achieved, no sailor could tell with any degree of accuracy the position of a ship at sea. The Knights Templar castle at Tomar was at the center of these discoveries. Here, in the very halls where medieval Templars had planned their crusades, Renaissance navigators plotted courses to the Indies and the New World. The accumulated knowledge of 2 centuries' maritime expertise, astronomical observations, cartographic techniques suddenly found new purpose in Portuguese exploration. King Dinis had also welcomed many Templar refugees to Portugal who brought astronomical, nautical, and cartographic knowledge. This wasn't just about preserving Templar assets. It was about preserving Templar expertise. The refugees carried in their heads the accumulated wisdom of generations of Templar navigators who had sailed between Europe and the Holy Land. Consider what this meant in practical terms. Portugal in the early 14th century suddenly acquired a cadre of experienced mariners, skilled financiers, and military engineers. They brought knowledge of shipbuilding techniques, navigation methods, and trading networks that spanned the Mediterranean and beyond. The Order of Christ dedicated itself to wars against Muslim states in Africa and the reconquest of Iberia from the Muslim people. But unlike the original Templars who had fought to reclaim Christian holy sites, the Order of Christ would fight to claim new lands for Portuguese expansion. By the time Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, Portuguese ships flying the cross of the Order of Christ had already established trading posts in Africa, discovered sea routes to India, and begun the colonization of Brazil. The financial and navigational resources originally assembled for the Crusades had been redirected toward global exploration. This transformation explains one of history's great puzzles: how a small, relatively poor kingdom on the edge of Europe suddenly became the world's premier maritime power. The answer lies partly in the survival and evolution of Templar resources through the Order of Christ. The Torre de Belém in Lisbon, built between 1514 and 1520, bears the distinctive cross of the Order of Christ on its exterior stonework. This cross was also emblazoned on the sails of Portuguese ships during their global explorations, a visible symbol of how Templar heritage had been transformed into Portuguese imperial power. But could some of the 18 ships that escaped from La Rochelle have found their way to Portugal? The answer is almost certainly yes. Portugal offered everything the Templar refugees needed: a sympathetic government, legal protection, and opportunities to continue their mission under a new name. Unlike Scotland, which was racked by warfare and offered uncertain sanctuary, Portugal provided institutional continuity. The Order of Christ wasn't a refuge for broken fugitives. It was a career opportunity for experienced professionals. Former Templars could maintain their lifestyle, continue their banking operations, and pursue their military calling under royal protection. The Portuguese solution solved the mystery of Templar survival not through dramatic last stands or treasure hunts, but through administrative efficiency and political pragmatism. King Dinas had effectively nationalized the Templars, bringing their resources under state control while preserving their institutional knowledge. This transformation had consequences that echoed through the centuries. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498, when Pedro Álvares Cabral claimed Brazil in 1500, when Portuguese traders established footholds in China and Japan, they carried with them the accumulated maritime expertise of the Knights Templar, transformed and redirected, but fundamentally unchanged. The ghost ships of La Rochelle may have sailed to many destinations, but some of them almost certainly found safe harbor in Portuguese ports, where their passengers could begin new lives under the protective banner of the Order of Christ. Of all the theories about where the Templar fleet found sanctuary, none has captured modern imagination quite like the story of Henry Sinclair's voyage to North America. According to this legend, a Scottish earl not only reached the New World nearly a century before Columbus, but did so with the help of Templar refugees carrying sacred treasures and secret knowledge. The story begins in 1398, when Henry I Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, allegedly left the Orkneys with 12 or 13 ships and journeyed to what is now Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. The tale states that he left Europe in 1398 to travel to Nova Scotia, outfitting 9 galleys, sometimes stated to be 12 with 300 men, and departed from his castle to make the journey. According to legend, they set foot on American soil on June 2, 1398. Eminent historians have corroborated the saga of their voyage from Zeno's ship's log, Zeno's narrative, which documented the exploration of Nova Scotia during the next year. The Zeno narrative, published in 1558, claims to be based on letters sent by 2 Venetian brothers, Niccolo and Antonio Zeno, who were allegedly shipwrecked in the North Atlantic and hired as navigators by a mysterious prince called Zishmani. In 1784, Johann Reinhold Forster identified this prince as Henry Sinclair, and the theory was born. But here's where the story becomes truly extraordinary. Proponents claim that Henry Sinclair was affiliated with the legendary Knights Templar, and that his voyage was actually a Templar expedition carrying sacred treasures to the New World. According to this theory, Sinclair founded a community in Nova Scotia as a site of refuge for the Templars and buried the Holy Grail at what is now Oak Island. The physical evidence cited for this voyage reads like a treasure hunter's wish list. At Westford in Massachusetts, There is a rock carving that some interpret as a medieval knight in armor, complete with a shield bearing the arms of the clan gun. The Westford Knight Memorial allegedly commemorates Sir James Gunn, who supposedly died during Sinclair's expedition. Then there's Newport Tower in Rhode Island, a stone structure that believers claim was built by Sinclair's expedition. The tower's architecture supposedly shows European influences that predate Columbus, making it evidence of pre-Columbian contact. Most intriguingly, Rosslyn Chapel, built by Henry Sinclair's grandson William in 1446, contains carvings that appear to show maize and other American plants. How could these images appear in a Scottish chapel if Henry Sinclair had not made his voyage to the New World nearly 50 years earlier? The theory has been elaborated by numerous writers, most notably Andrew Sinclair, a direct descendant of Henry, who described him as a crusader, a Gnostic, a Knight Templar, and a Freemason. According to Knight and Lomas, the Templars learned that to sail to a westerly continent, they had to follow a star called l'America, named after the Nasarayan Mandaean morning star. But modern scholarship has systematically demolished every element of this romantic narrative. The Zeno narrative, the foundation of the entire theory, is now widely regarded as a 16th century hoax. The letters and map supposedly sent by the Zeno brothers contain geographical impossibilities and anachronistic details that prove they were fabricated centuries after the alleged voyage. Historians Mark Oxbrow, Ian Robertson, Karen Rawls, and Louise Yeoman have each made it clear that the Sinclair family had no connection with the medieval Knights Templar. In fact, Karen Rawls has shown that among those testifying against the Templars at their 1309 trial were Henry and William Sinclair, an act inconsistent with any alleged support or membership. The physical evidence fares no better under scrutiny. The Westford Knight has been analyzed by archaeologists who conclude it's a natural rock formation, with some modern carving added in the 18th or 19th centuries. Newport Tower has been definitively dated to the 17th century through architectural analysis and radiocarbon dating. It was built as a windmill by colonial settlers. As for the mysterious American plants carved in Rosslyn Chapel, botanists point out that the supposed maize carvings actually depict wheat sheaves, while the alleged cactus plants are stylized lilies. The entire identification rests on wishful thinking rather than botanical accuracy. William Thompson, in his book, The New History of Orkney, wrote it has been Earl Henry's singular fate to enjoy an ever-expanding posthumous reputation which has very little to do with anything he achieved in his lifetime. The Henry Sinclair voyage theory suffers from the same fundamental problem as most Templar conspiracy theories. It requires the acceptance of forged documents, misidentified archaeological evidence, and historical connections that cannot be proven. There is not one single authentic medieval document that confirms a holy bloodline of Jesus, links Henry Sinclair to the Knights Templar, or documents any voyage by Henry Sinclair to anywhere outside of Europe. But perhaps the most damaging evidence against the Sinclair Templar connection comes from timing. The claim requires not only that the Zeno narrative is authentic, but that the voyage described around 1398 actually reached North America, and that the mysterious Zishmani is Henry Sinclair. But this theory also requires the acceptance that the order was suppressed almost half a century before Henry's lifetime. The psychological appeal of the Henry Sinclair story is obvious. It combines mysterious knights, secret voyages, hidden treasures, and the discovery of America into a single narrative. It suggests that the official history of exploration is wrong, that brave men carrying sacred knowledge reached the New World long before the Spanish conquistadors arrived with their gold-hungry brutality. But the evidence simply doesn't support these romantic claims. Henry Sinclair was a real historical figure, a Scottish nobleman who ruled Orkney in the late 14th century. But there is no credible evidence that he ever sailed beyond European waters, much less that he carried Templar treasures to North America. The legend of Henry Sinclair and the Templar voyage to America tells us more about modern desires for alternative history than about medieval reality. We want to believe that the Templars found a better ending than torture and execution, that sacred knowledge was preserved in secret, and that the New World was discovered by noble knights rather than gold-seeking conquistadors. But history rarely provides such satisfying narratives. The real fate of the Templar fleet was probably more prosaic and more complex than any of the romantic theories suggest. The ghost ships of La Rochelle sailed toward destinations that history has forgotten, carrying secrets that may never be revealed. The search for the vanished fleet continues, but it must be grounded in evidence rather than wishful thinking. The truth about what happened to the Knights Templar's treasure may be stranger than fiction, but it will only be found through careful historical investigation, not through conspiracy theories and fabricated documents. To understand what really happened to the Templar fleet, we need to strip away centuries of romantic speculation and examine the hard realities of medieval shipping navigation and wealth storage. The question isn't just where the 18 ships went. It's what they could realistically have carried and how far they could have traveled with their cargo. Let's start with the ships themselves. Modern maritime archaeologists estimate that 18 medieval vessels could carry between 1,500 and 3,000 tons of cargo, depending on their size and design. But these weren't modern container ships. They were 14th century vessels with significant limitations. The ships would have been very small by modern standards, too shallow in draft, and sailing too low in the water to be able to withstand the heavy waves and winds of the open Atlantic, and suited for use only in the relatively shallow waters of the continental shelf. This immediately calls into question the more exotic theories about Templar voyages to America. Medieval ships suitable for wine transport between La Rochelle and England were not designed for transoceanic voyages. They lacked the deep keels, reinforced hulls, and specialized rigging needed for Atlantic crossings. But what about the cargo itself? The Templars did have ships to carry personnel, pilgrims, and supplies across the Mediterranean between the west and east and back. But if the hospital after 1312 is any guide, they did not have more than 4 galleys warships and few other ships, and if they needed more, they hired them. This suggests that the official figure for the Templar fleet at La Rochelle, a measly couple of short-distance cargo ships, may have been deliberately understated. Given the wealth the order had at their disposal, the Templars could have chartered a number of vessels to serve their needs secretly. So what did 18 ships carry away from La Rochelle? The answer requires understanding what constituted treasure in the medieval world. This wasn't just gold and silver coins stacked in chests like a pirate movie. Templar wealth was sophisticated and diversified. Consider the forms of medieval wealth. Precious metals, certainly, but also jewelry, religious artifacts, illuminated manuscripts, silk fabrics, spices, ivory, and amber. More importantly, the Templars held extensive documentation, property deeds, loan agreements, letters of credit, diplomatic correspondence, and detailed financial records spanning 2 centuries. But perhaps the most valuable cargo wasn't material at all. It was knowledge. The Templars had absorbed astronomical, nautical, and cartographic knowledge from Arab and Jewish scholars during their time in the Holy Land. They possessed maps, navigation techniques, and trade route information that would have been invaluable to any maritime organization. Think about this. Practically, if you were Gerard de Villiers organizing the evacuation of Templar assets, what would you prioritize? Certainly portable wealth, gold, silver, precious gems. But also the documents that proved Templar property rights across Europe, the maps and charts that guided their maritime operations, the religious relics that legitimized their spiritual authority. Most importantly, you would prioritize the people who possessed specialized knowledge navigators, who knew Atlantic sailing routes, Administrators who understood international banking, military engineers who could design fortifications, and diplomatic agents who maintained relationships with foreign courts. The official records of La Rochelle show that the Templars were exporting wine by ship. This wasn't a fleet in any modern sense. Those would have been transport vessels rather than warships, and the Templars probably hired them as they needed them rather than buying their own. But wine barrels make excellent concealment for other cargo. A fleet officially carrying wine could easily transport precious metals, documents, and even passengers without attracting attention. The wine trade provided perfect cover for moving valuable assets while maintaining commercial legitimacy. Modern analysis suggests that the treasure loaded onto the 18 ships was probably diverse, some precious metals and jewelry certainly, but also extensive archives, religious artifacts, specialized equipment, and most importantly, the human resources needed to re-establish Templar operations elsewhere. The testimony of Jean de Chalon, who reported that Gérard de Villiers fled with 50 horses and 18 ships, provides a crucial clue. 50 horses represent significant transportation capacity, enough to move substantial cargo from inland locations to the port. But they also suggest that the evacuation involved considerable personnel, since horses require handlers, equipment, and supplies. This picture emerges not a romantic treasure fleet, carrying the Holy Grail to mystical destinations, but a carefully planned, corporate relocation. The Templars were moving their most valuable assets, financial, intellectual, and human, to predetermined safe locations where they could continue operations under new identities. The timing supports this interpretation. The evacuation occurred over several days, not in a single panicked night. Wagon trains moved systematically from Templar properties to La Rochelle, loading cargo that had been carefully selected and prepared. This was asset management, not treasure hunting. But here's what makes the operation truly remarkable: it worked. 7 centuries later, historians still can't definitively say where the fleet went or what happened to its cargo. That level of operational security suggests professional intelligence planning, not amateur adventure. The 18 ships probably dispersed to multiple destinations, carrying different types of cargo to different safe havens. Some may have reached Portugal, where former Templars could join the Order of Christ. Others might have sailed to Cyprus or other Mediterranean locations, still friendly to the order. A few could have reached Scotland or Ireland, where political chaos provided opportunities for new identities. But none carried the treasure of the Knights Templar as a single hoard. Instead, they carried the distributed assets of a sophisticated international organization, assets that could be reconstituted elsewhere to continue the Order's mission under new names and new patrons. The real treasure wasn't a chest of gold coins waiting to be discovered on some remote island. It was the institutional knowledge and financial expertise that allowed the Templars to survive, adapt, and influence the development of European banking, navigation, and exploration for centuries to come. The ghost fleet of La Rochelle succeeded not by disappearing into legend, but by integrating so successfully into the medieval world that their ultimate fate became invisible to history. After following the ghost fleet across 7 centuries of speculation, conspiracy theories, and archaeological investigation, we're left with a fundamental question. Why does the mystery of the Templar ships continue to captivate us when the historical evidence is so fragmentary? The answer lies in understanding how conspiracy theories evolve and why human beings are drawn to stories that challenge official historical narratives. The legend of the vanished Templar fleet isn't just about medieval ships. It's about our relationship with mystery, authority, and the possibility that hidden truths are waiting to be discovered. The modern Templar conspiracy industry began in earnest in 1982 with the publication of Holy Blood, Holy Grail by Michael Bagant, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln. This book, which claims that the Templars were guardians of Jesus Christ's bloodline through his marriage to Mary Magdalene connected numerous medieval mysteries into a single grand narrative. Publishers saw a synergy from the 1980s onwards in trying to connect Templarism, Freemasonry, Rosslyn Chapel, esoteric belief systems, and Scotland together. The success of Holy Blood, Holy Grail spawned dozens of imitators, each adding new layers to an increasingly elaborate mythology. The process accelerated with Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code in 2003, which brought Templar conspiracy theories to a global audience. Brown's book helped popularize the belief that the arrests of October 13, 1307, are the reason people fear Friday the 13th. Though historians note this connection is largely fictional. But here's what's fascinating about this evolution. Each generation of conspiracy theorists has projected its own concerns onto the Templar mystery. Cold War-era writers emphasized secret societies and hidden governments. New Age enthusiasts focused on spiritual secrets and ancient wisdom. Modern conspiracy theorists stress financial manipulation and cover-ups by religious authorities. The truth about the vanished fleet has been obscured by this layering of modern concerns onto medieval events. When we read about Templar ships sailing to America with the Holy Grail, we're not learning about 14th century history. We're encountering 20th and 21st century anxieties about authority secrecy and hidden truth. Modern researchers estimate that the Scottish faced English forces 1.5 to 3 times their number at Bannockburn, making Templar intervention unnecessary to explain Scottish victory. The idea has an unpleasant result for the Scots, because it makes out that Robert Bruce was incapable of defeating the English without foreign help. Similarly, the Portuguese transformation of the Templars into the Order of Christ is well documented historically, but it lacks the dramatic appeal of secret voyages and buried treasure. The real story of Templar survival, administrative efficiency, and political pragmatism doesn't sell books or inspire movies. The psychological appeal of Templar conspiracy theories rests on several powerful human desires. First, the desire for justice. We want the innocent victims of Philip IV's persecution to find safety and redemption. Second, the desire for hidden knowledge. We want to believe that important truths are being concealed from ordinary people. Third, the desire for meaning. We want medieval events to have cosmic significance rather than mundane political explanations. But perhaps most importantly, Templar conspiracy theories appeal to our desire to be special, to possess knowledge that ordinary people lack, to see patterns that historians miss, to be part of an enlightened minority that understands hidden truths. This is why conspiracy theories persist despite contrary evidence. They provide psychological satisfaction that factual history cannot match. The real story of the Templar fleet, that it probably dispersed to multiple mundane destinations, where former Templars integrated into existing institutions, lacks the drama and significance that conspiracy enthusiasts crave. Understanding this psychology helps explain why the mystery of the vanished fleet has grown more elaborate over time, rather than less. Each failed theory spawns new theories that incorporate the failure as evidence of deeper conspiracy. When the Newport Tower is proven to be a 17th century windmill conspiracy, theorists don't abandon the theory, they argue that the dating has been falsified to conceal the truth. This process reveals something profound about how alternative histories develop. They begin with genuine historical mysteries, like the fate of the Templar fleet, but evolve into self-sustaining belief systems that become immune to contrary evidence. The real tragedy is that this mythology has obscured the genuine historical significance of the Knights Templar. They were remarkable enough without fictional embellishments, the world's first international banking system, pioneers of military architecture, developers of agricultural and maritime technology, and bridge builders between Christian and Islamic civilizations. The Templars were also the victims of one of history's earliest propaganda campaigns, subjected to systematic character assassination that combined religious hysteria with political calculation. King Philip IV's campaign against them employed techniques that would be immediately recognizable to any modern student of information. Warfare, coordinated messaging, repeated accusations regardless of evidence, and the use of torture to manufacture confessions that supported predetermined narratives. If there were ever such a thing as a post-truth era, it began precisely 710 years ago at dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, in the Kingdom of France. Philip's accusations were widely circulated, and his campaign to destroy the Templars rested on the relentless, repetitive dissemination of his baseless claims in every public arena he could find. The charges Philip leveled against the Templars were written up in formal letters of condemnation expressed through hyperbole that would be in no way out of place in the average Twitter storm today. The Templars were condemned en masse as having disgraced the French flag and the country. Their crimes, wrote the king, were horrible to contemplate, terrible to hear of. Over several years, this medieval fake news was repeated over and over again, its loudness and frequency making up for the fact that it was a lie, until in 1312 a council of the Church reached the conclusion that the Templars' name had been so blackened the order's members ought to be forcibly retired. The first reason given by the papal order dissolving the Templars was the very fact of infamy, suspicion, noisy insinuation. This historical parallel should give us pause. The techniques used to destroy the Knights Templar coordinated disinformation, character assassination, and the creation of alternative facts are remarkably similar to those employed in modern political and social media campaigns. The medieval world was not as different from our own as we might think, but understanding this parallel also helps us see why Templar conspiracy theories persist. They tap into genuine suspicions about authority, power, and the manipulation of truth. People who feel that official narratives are unreliable naturally gravitate toward alternative explanations, even when those alternatives lack supporting evidence. The irony is that the real story of the Knights Templar is actually a case study in how powerful interests can destroy organizations that threaten their control, manipulate public opinion through propaganda, and rewrite history to justify their actions. This is exactly the kind of conspiracy that modern conspiracy theorists claim to oppose, yet they ignore the documented historical example in favor of fictional alternatives. So what happened to the 18 ships that disappeared from La Rochelle on the night of October 12, 1307? The honest answer is that we don't know, and we probably never will. The Templars succeeded too well in concealing their escape routes. The medieval world was large enough and poorly documented enough that a fleet could disappear and remain hidden for centuries. But we can make educated guesses based on the available evidence. Some ships probably reached Portugal, where Templar assets were being transferred to the newly created Order of Christ. Others may have sailed to Cyprus, where the order had extensive holdings and connections. A few might have reached Scotland or Ireland, where political chaos provided opportunities for former Templars to establish new identities. The cargo was probably distributed among multiple destinations, precious metals and portable wealth to safe banks and allies' documents and archives to locations where they could be preserved, and accessed personnel to places where they could continue their work under new names and new organizations. The great treasure of the Knights Templar wasn't a single hoard waiting to be discovered. It was the distributed assets of a sophisticated international organization, financial resources, institutional knowledge, and human expertise that could be reconstituted elsewhere to influence the development of European civilization. In Portugal, this reconstitution succeeded brilliantly. The Order of Christ preserved Templar resources and knowledge, applying them to the age of exploration and helping Portugal become a global maritime power. The cross of the Order of Christ flew on Portuguese ships that reached India, China, Brazil, and eventually every corner of the world. In other locations, former Templars probably integrated into existing institutions, bringing their expertise to banking houses, military orders, and royal administrations throughout Europe. Their influence became invisible precisely because it was so successful. They didn't need to operate in secret societies or hidden conspiracies because they had been absorbed into the mainstream of European development. The vanished fleet of La Rochelle represents one of history's most successful escape operations, not because it carried treasure to romantic hiding places, but because it enabled the preservation and transformation of institutional knowledge that continued to shape European civilization for centuries. The ghost ships didn't disappear into legend, they sailed into history, carrying with them the accumulated wisdom of 2 centuries and the seeds of future European expansion across the globe. The real treasure they carried wasn't gold or relics, but the human knowledge and institutional expertise that would help create the modern world. As we reach the end of our journey following the ghost fleet of the Knights Templar, we find ourselves confronting a truth more complex and more fascinating than any conspiracy theory. The greatest treasures often hide in plain sight, and the most successful escapes are those that never appear to have happened at all. 718 years have passed since 18 ships slipped away from La Rochelle into the Atlantic darkness. In all that time, despite countless expeditions, archaeological investigations, and theoretical reconstructions, no one has definitively located the Templar fleet or its cargo. This isn't because the mystery is unsolvable, it's because the mystery was solved so successfully that it became invisible. Think about what we've discovered in our investigation. The Knights Templar weren't mysterious occultists guarding cosmic secrets. They were sophisticated international bankers and military contractors who had accumulated vast wealth and expertise over 2 centuries. When they faced destruction, they didn't scatter randomly hoping for divine intervention. They executed a carefully planned evacuation that preserved their most valuable assets. The 18 ships didn't carry a single great treasure to one dramatic destination. They carried distributed assets to multiple safe locations where former Templars could continue their work under new names and new organizations. This is why the treasure hunt has failed. There was no treasure in the romantic sense, only the practical resources of an institution transforming itself to survive. We've seen how this transformation succeeded most brilliantly in Portugal, where the Order of Christ preserved Templar resources and applied them to global exploration. The cross that once flew over Templar commanderies in the Holy Land was redesigned and carried on Portuguese ships to India, China, Africa, and the Americas. The banking expertise developed in medieval Europe was applied to financing the Age of Discovery. But the Portuguese transformation was only the most visible example of Templar survival. Throughout Europe, former Templars probably integrated into existing institutions, bringing their specialized knowledge to banks, royal administrations, military orders, and trading companies. Their influence became so thoroughly absorbed into European development that it disappeared from view. This integration explains why the conspiracy theories persist and why they're ultimately misguided. People sense correctly that something significant happened when the Templars were destroyed, that their influence didn't simply vanish with their official dissolution. But instead of recognizing the successful transformation and integration of Templar resources, conspiracy theorists invent hidden societies, secret treasures, and mystical knowledge that supposedly survived in the shadows. The reality is more remarkable than the fiction. The Knights Templar influenced European development so profoundly that their legacy became part of the foundation of modern civilization. Their banking innovations contributed to the development of international finance. Their maritime expertise helped launch the Age of Exploration. Their military engineering influenced fortress design for centuries. Their diplomatic networks helped establish the framework for international relations. But perhaps most importantly, the Templars demonstrated something that resonates across the centuries: the power of institutional knowledge to survive even the most coordinated attempts at destruction. Philip IV could arrest the knights, torture them into confessions, and burn their leaders at the stake. but he couldn't destroy the accumulated wisdom of 2 centuries, or prevent that wisdom from finding new channels of expression. This lesson has contemporary relevance that extends far beyond medieval history. In our own era of rapid technological change and institutional disruption, we're witnessing the same dynamics that played out in 1307 established organizations, facing existential threats, knowledge, and resources flowing to new structures, and the emergence of new forms of power that make previous arrangements obsolete. The story of the vanished Templar fleet is ultimately a story about adaptation and survival in times of crisis. It shows how sophisticated organizations plan for contingencies, how valuable resources can be preserved even when institutional structures are destroyed, and how influence can persist and grow even when it becomes invisible to casual observation. The ghost ships of La Rochelle succeeded because they didn't try to preserve the Knights Templar as a museum piece. Instead, they carried the essence of the organization, its knowledge, its resources, its human expertise, to places where it could evolve and grow in new forms. The Order of Christ wasn't a Templar nostalgia society. It was a forward-looking organization that applied medieval resources to Renaissance challenges. This transformation offers hope for our own time. When faced with institutional collapse, technological disruption, or political persecution, the solution isn't to retreat into fantasy or conspiracy theory. The solution is to identify what's truly valuable: knowledge, relationships, resources, principles, and find new ways to preserve and apply those assets in changed circumstances. The Templars understood that survival meant transformation, not preservation. They didn't try to maintain their medieval structure in a world that had moved beyond it. Instead, they contributed their accumulated wisdom to new structures that could thrive in the emerging European landscape. 7 centuries later, we can still see their influence in the global financial system. They helped create the exploration routes they helped establish, and the institutional innovations they helped develop. The Templars achieved a form of immortality not through mystical secrets or hidden treasures, but through practical contributions that became so integral to European civilization that they disappeared into the foundation of modernity. The 18 ships that vanished from La Rochelle didn't sail off the edge of the world, they sailed into the future, carrying with them the seeds of developments that wouldn't fully flower for centuries. The greatest treasure they preserved wasn't gold or relics, but the human knowledge and institutional wisdom that would help transform medieval Europe into the modern world. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all: true treasure isn't something you bury and hide, it's something you invest and develop. The Knights Templar understood this, which is why their ghost fleet continues to sail through history, still influencing our world in ways both visible and invisible. The mystery of the vanished Templar fleet will probably never be solved in the dramatic way that conspiracy theorists hope. There will be no single great discovery, no hidden chamber full of gold and ancient secrets. But the real story, the story of how medieval wisdom was preserved, transformed and integrated into European development, is far more remarkable than any fictional treasure hunt. The fleet sails on, not in some hidden harbor waiting to be discovered, but in the institutions, innovations, and ideas that continue to shape our world today. The greatest mystery isn't where the ships went, it's how completely their mission succeeded. In the end, the Knights Templar achieved something that no amount of treasure could buy. They became part of history itself, invisible but indispensable, vanished but everywhere present. The ghost fleet of La Rochelle didn't disappear into legend, it sailed into immortality. The truth, as always, was hiding in plain sight. We just had to know how to look for it.